Hello. Welcome back to Let's Talk Ray Bradbury. If you've not subscribed to our channel, please do that now. It'd be perfect time to do that, and that would be a big help. Thank you. So here on Let's Talk Ray Bradbury, as you probably know, we have been reading through the collection These Stories of Ray Bradbury. Today we are up to story number 95 of 100, which is The Black Ferris from 1948, leaving just 6 more stories to go, including this one. The way these reviews work is I do a brief synopsis of what happens in this story, and then I like to wrap up with just some thoughts and feelings about what it all means, and if I enjoyed it, if I thought it was a decent story. So as for that synopsis, the carnival has been in town for about 3 weeks, and young Hank has spotted something strange amongst the exhibits and rides and various assorted oddities. On a dark and stormy night that is closed the carnival down, more or less, Hank takes his friend Peter to the edge of the carnival, climbs a tree, and says, "You have to see what's going to happen next." There is a large black Ferris whale, and a man, Mr. Cougar, who is known to be the proprietor of the carnival, he hops onto the Ferris wheel, as meanwhile a little hunchback man turns on the wheel. The wheel begins to spin backwards. It spins backwards 25 times, and when it finally stops, a little boy gets off of the ride. Hank and Peter follow the little boy to the house of a wealthy woman named Mrs. Foley. Mrs. Foley's little boy died many, many years ago, and she's brought in an orphan to her home who she calls Joseph Pikes. Hank, along with Peter, they go up to the door, and they knock on it, and they tell her, this little boy, he's not a little boy, he's Mr. Cougar, he's a grown man, and he's going to steal all your money. Mrs. Foley runs him out of the house. Hank and Peter go back to their respective homes. Of course, they arrive soaking wet with fear of catching pneumonia. Hank's father grounds him immediately, takes all of his clothes so he can't run off outside and go anywhere. But he doesn't ground him quick enough because he's made a phone call to Peter, and they've arranged to meet each other and to sort of solve this mystery. They're convinced that that little Joseph Pikes, who is Mr. Cougar, is in fact a thief, and that he plans to take all of her Mrs. Foley's money and run away with it, and then he won't be able to find out who did it because he'll turn back into a grown man. So they go back to the house, and Mrs. Foley's house. They follow the little boy, and he in fact has a sack in his arm. They follow him all the way back to the carnival. He hops on the ride. The hunchback engages it. It begins running forward time and time again. But they get in the way. They try to stop him, chop the hunchback. They stab him with a tent spike, and something gets jammed in the mechanism. And up on the Ferris wheel, you can hear somebody yelling, but it's not stopping. It turns time and time again. This draws a crowd of people who work at the carnival and have been hiding in their tents away from the rain. And they've all gathered, but when they finally get it stopped, they bring the car back down, and all they find is a sack of money and a skeleton. So the boys were, in fact, right. All right, so not a particularly great story in the Bradbury canon. And by that I mean it's got no real poignant philosophical underpinnings as many of his do, but it's fun nonetheless, full of action and zaniness, and it very much reminds me of the Tom Hanks film Big from the 80s. But creepy carnivals feature a lot in Bradbury's work, some dozens of short stories, and I have to wonder about that. Him having died in the early 2000s at nearly 100 years old, you have to look back to the time of his childhood. And I feel like it's very likely that carnivals and all their mystery and kookiness must have played a formative part in his life. I think that's very, very likely. Today, carnivals, they still exist. There's carnivals and fairs everywhere, but they've really changed. Like the circus, all the allegations of animal abuse has sort of taken away that element. And then, of course, people who we used to call freaks lovingly, like now that's sort of taboo as well. But yeah, I really do feel like this story, more than many of his other stories, is certainly sort of pinned to a very different time and place in the early 1900s, and maybe even earlier than that. But yeah, like I said, not a lot of interesting things going under the surface of this story. I'm not going to be thinking about it for very long, but it was fun. It was filled with a lot of action and atmosphere, and I quite enjoyed it, and I think that you will enjoy it too. All right, so moving on, we will now have just 5 more stories to go in this collection. The next story is Farewell to Summer from 1980, and this was actually the this book that I've been reading from, The Stories of Ray Bradbury, was the first time that this story ever appeared, so it's obviously written new for this collection, so I'm interested to check that out. But that will have to wait for another day. See you later.